Alexander Blackwood stood at the edge of his sprawling estate, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the ancient oak trees that bordered his property. The mansion behind him, a Gothic masterpiece built in the 1800s, cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. To the outside world, he was simply a wealthy businessman who inherited his family's vast fortune. But Alexander carried a secret that would terrify most people. He was one of the last remaining vampire kings, a bloodline that stretched back over 8 centuries. His wife Isabella had been gone for 3 years now. Cancer had taken her, despite all his supernatural abilities and connections to ancient remedies. Even immortal beings, it seemed, couldn't always save the ones they loved most. Isabella had been his anchor to humanity, the one person who knew his true nature and loved him anyway. She had given him 3 beautiful children, triplets named Marcus, Elena, and Adrian, who were now 15 years old and completely unaware of their father's supernatural heritage. The children attended Millbrook Academy, an exclusive private school about 20 minutes from their home. They were popular, intelligent, and seemingly normal teenagers. Marcus excelled in sports, particularly basketball and track. Elena had inherited her mother's artistic talents and spent most of her free time painting or playing piano. Adrian was the intellectual of the group, already taking advanced mathematics and science courses that challenged even college students. Alexander had made a promise to Isabella on her deathbed that he would give their children as normal a life as possible. He would never reveal his true nature unless absolutely necessary. He hired the best tutors, enrolled them in the finest schools, and made sure they wanted for nothing. But as they grew older, he noticed subtle changes in each of them that made him wonder if his supernatural bloodline was beginning to manifest. The Blackwood family employed a small but dedicated staff to maintain their massive estate. There was Margaret, the head housekeeper who had worked for the family for over 20 years. She was a stern but caring woman in her 60s who treated the triplets like her own grandchildren. The grounds were maintained by Roberto and his crew, who came 3 times a week to keep everything pristine. The chef, Henri, prepared all their meals with restaurant-quality skill. But it was Thomas Mitchell, the night janitor, who seemed to notice things that others missed. Thomas was a quiet man in his 40s who had been hired about 6 months ago. He worked the night shift, cleaning the mansion's many rooms while the family slept. Thomas was thorough, reliable, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. Alexander appreciated having someone who respected his family's privacy, especially since he himself was most active during the nighttime hours. What Alexander didn't know was that Thomas had been observing him carefully since the day he started working. Thomas had grown up hearing stories from his grandmother about creatures that lived among humans, hiding their true nature behind wealth and influence. His grandmother had been what some people called a sensitive, someone who could detect supernatural beings. She had passed some of that ability down to Thomas, though he had spent most of his adult life trying to ignore it. The night Thomas first saw Alexander's reflection disappear completely in the hallway mirror, he knew his grandmother's stories were true. He began paying closer attention, noticing how Alexander never ate the meals Henri prepared, how he never seemed to sleep, and how the temperature in any room seemed to drop several degrees whenever he entered. Thomas also noticed that Alexander's study was filled with books written in languages that looked centuries old, and there were paintings on the walls that depicted people who looked remarkably similar to Alexander, despite the fact that they were supposedly painted hundreds of years ago. Alexander, for his part, was becoming increasingly concerned about his children. Marcus had begun showing signs of enhanced physical abilities that went far beyond normal athletic talent. During a recent basketball game, Thomas had been at the school doing some evening maintenance work and witnessed Marcus make a shot from nearly half court with impossible accuracy. The ball seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should allow, and Marcus moved with a grace and speed that seemed almost supernatural. Elena's artistic abilities were developing in ways that seemed to transcend normal human talent. Her paintings were becoming so lifelike that they seemed to move when viewed from certain angles. She had painted a portrait of her mother that was so realistic and emotionally powerful that Alexander had to remove it from the main hallway because guests were disturbed by how the eyes seemed to follow them. Elena herself didn't seem to understand how she was creating these effects. Adrian's intellectual development was perhaps the most concerning. He had begun solving complex mathematical problems that should have been impossible for someone his age. More troubling, he had started asking questions about their family history that seemed to indicate he was piecing together information about their supernatural heritage. He had found some of Alexander's older books and was asking about the languages they were written in. He had also begun staying up later and later, as if his natural sleep cycle was shifting toward the nocturnal pattern that vampires typically followed. Alexander knew he would soon have to make some difficult decisions about his children's future. If they were indeed developing supernatural abilities, they would need guidance and training to control them. But revealing the truth would mean breaking the promise he had made to Isabella about giving them a normal life. The situation became more complicated when Alexander decided he was ready to consider dating again. Isabella had been gone for 3 years, and while he would always love her, he was beginning to feel the loneliness that came with immortality. He had met someone, a woman named Victoria Sterling, who worked as a curator at the local art museum. She was intelligent, cultured, and had an appreciation for history that Alexander found refreshing. She was also completely human, which presented its own set of challenges. Victoria had shoulder-length auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to change color depending on the lighting. She was in her early 30s, having dedicated most of her 20s to completing her graduate studies in art history. She had moved to their town about a year ago to take the curator position, and she lived alone in a converted loft apartment above a bookstore in the historic downtown district. Alexander had met Victoria at a charity auction where she was representing the museum. He had donated several pieces from his personal collection, and she had been impressed by his knowledge of art history and the provenance of the pieces. They had begun talking regularly, first about art and history, then about more personal topics. Victoria found Alexander mysterious and intriguing. He was clearly wealthy and well-educated, but there was something about him that seemed almost otherworldly. They had been dating for about 2 months when Alexander decided he needed to test whether Victoria could accept his true nature. He couldn't bear the thought of falling in love again only to lose someone because they couldn't handle what he really was. But he also couldn't risk revealing his secret directly, especially with his children's safety to consider. Alexander decided to use his children as a way to test Victoria's reactions to supernatural phenomena. If she could accept unexplainable things happening around the triplets, perhaps she could eventually accept the truth about their family. He began inviting Victoria to dinner at the mansion more frequently, making sure she had opportunities to observe the children's developing abilities. The first test came when Victoria attended one of Marcus's basketball games. Alexander had suggested they go to support his son, knowing that Marcus's abilities were becoming more difficult to hide during games. During the third quarter, Marcus made a series of plays that defied explanation. He seemed to anticipate where the ball would be before it was passed, moved faster than any teenager should be able to, and made shots that seemed to bend the laws of physics. Victoria noticed something was unusual about Marcus's performance, but she attributed it to exceptional natural talent and intensive training. She was impressed by his abilities and mentioned to Alexander that Marcus might have a future as a professional athlete. Alexander watched her carefully for signs of suspicion or fear, but she seemed genuinely pleased by Marcus's success. The second test involved Elena's art. Alexander invited Victoria to view some of Elena's recent paintings, including the disturbing portrait of Isabella that he had removed from the hallway. Victoria spent a long time studying the paintings, clearly moved by their emotional intensity and technical skill. She commented that Elena had an unusual gift for capturing not just physical likeness but the essence of her subjects. When Victoria viewed the portrait of Isabella, Alexander watched her reaction carefully. The painting's eyes did seem to follow viewers, and there was an almost supernatural quality to the way light seemed to emanate from the canvas. Victoria stood in front of it for several minutes, clearly affected by something she couldn't quite name. She asked Alexander about the woman in the painting, and he explained that it was his late wife, Elena's mother. Victoria's response surprised him. Instead of being disturbed by the painting's unusual qualities, she was moved by the love and loss she could sense in both the artwork and in Alexander's explanation. She told him that she could feel the depth of his love for his wife and his grief at losing her. She also said that Elena had clearly inherited not just artistic talent but an ability to capture spiritual qualities that most artists could never achieve. The third test was the most dangerous. Alexander decided to expose Victoria to Adrian's intellectual abilities, knowing that his son's questions about their family history were becoming more probing. He invited Victoria for dinner on a night when he knew Adrian would be working on a particularly challenging research project about historical bloodlines and genealogy. During dinner, Adrian began discussing some of the historical research he had been conducting about their family. He had traced the Blackwood name back several centuries and had found some unusual gaps and inconsistencies in the historical records. He mentioned that there seemed to be multiple Alexander Blackwoods throughout history who had lived unusually long lives, and he wondered if there might be some kind of family tradition of adopting the same name across generations. Alexander felt his heart stop as his son continued talking. Adrian had clearly been researching much more than he had realized, and his questions were getting dangerously close to the truth. But instead of shutting down the conversation, Alexander decided to see how Victoria would react to Adrian's unusual insights and the strange historical connections he was uncovering. Victoria listened to Adrian's research with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about his methodology and sources. She was impressed by his thoroughness and his ability to piece together historical puzzles, including references to the Blackwood family in historical documents that seemed to span impossibly long periods. Victoria suggested that perhaps the family had a tradition of careful record-keeping and genealogy that allowed them to maintain detailed historical knowledge. Alexander was both relieved and concerned by Victoria's rational explanations for the supernatural elements that Adrian was uncovering. On one hand, her ability to find logical explanations meant she wasn't immediately suspicious of their true nature. On the other hand, it also meant that she might have difficulty accepting the truth when the time came to reveal it. Thomas Mitchell had been observing all of these interactions with growing concern. As the night janitor, he had access to the mansion during the evening hours when these dinners and conversations were taking place. He had developed a routine of cleaning the dining room and adjacent areas during the times when Alexander entertained Victoria, which allowed him to overhear many of their conversations. Thomas had recognized Victoria as a potential threat to the family's secret from the moment Alexander began bringing her around regularly. Not because Victoria was malicious or dangerous, but because she was intelligent and observant. Thomas had seen how she looked at the unusual artifacts in Alexander's study, how she asked probing questions about the family's history, and how she seemed to sense that there was more to the Blackwood family than met the eye. What concerned Thomas most was that Alexander seemed to be deliberately exposing Victoria to supernatural elements, almost as if he was testing her reactions. Thomas had worked around supernatural beings long enough to know that this kind of testing rarely ended well. Either Victoria would figure out the truth and potentially expose the family, or Alexander would eventually have to eliminate her as a threat to their security. Thomas had also been observing the triplets more closely, and he was alarmed by how rapidly their abilities were developing. Marcus's physical enhancements were becoming so pronounced that Thomas worried other people would start noticing. Elena's paintings were taking on qualities that went beyond artistic talent into the realm of supernatural influence. Adrian's intellectual development and his research into the family history suggested that he might soon figure out the truth about his father's nature. Thomas faced a difficult decision. His job was simply to clean the mansion and maintain discretion about the family's affairs, but his grandmother had taught him that knowledge of supernatural beings came with responsibility. If the Blackwood family's secret was exposed, it could endanger not just them, but potentially other supernatural beings who lived hidden among humans. Thomas decided he needed to find a way to warn Alexander about the risks he was taking with Victoria, without revealing how much he himself knew about the family's true nature. He began leaving subtle signs that he was aware of supernatural elements in the household, hoping that Alexander would realize his knowledge and perhaps seek his advice. Alexander, however, was too focused on his relationship with Victoria to notice Thomas's attempts at communication. He was falling in love again despite his efforts to remain objective during his testing process. Victoria was everything he had hoped to find in a partner. Intelligent, kind, cultured, and seemingly accepting of the unusual aspects of his family's life. The crisis point came on a Friday evening in early November. Alexander had invited Victoria for dinner, and all 3 children would be present. He had decided that this would be his final test. He would observe Victoria's reactions to all 3 children displaying their abilities simultaneously, and then make his decision about whether to reveal the truth about his nature. What Alexander didn't anticipate was that his children had been discussing their developing abilities among themselves, and they had begun to suspect that their father was hiding something important about their family. They had decided to confront him that evening, regardless of whether Victoria was present. Thomas was working in the study adjacent to the dining room that night, and he could hear the conversation escalating in ways that made him increasingly nervous. The children were asking direct questions about their unusual abilities and their family's history. Alexander was trying to deflect while simultaneously watching Victoria's reactions. Victoria was clearly sensing the tension in the room but didn't understand the source of the family's obvious distress. The situation reached a breaking point when Adrian directly asked his father if their family was different from other families in ways that went beyond wealth and social status. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Thomas could hear the silence stretching uncomfortably long. Alexander realized that the evening he had planned as a final test for Victoria had instead become the moment when his children demanded the truth he had been hiding from them for their entire lives. He looked around the table at Marcus, Elena, and Adrian, his beloved children, who were no longer children but young adults who deserved honesty about their heritage. He looked at Victoria, the woman he was falling in love with, who was watching this family drama unfold with compassion and concern. In that moment, Alexander made a decision that would change all of their lives forever. But before he could speak, Thomas Mitchell stepped into the dining room doorway, his expression grave and determined. "Mr. Blackwood," Thomas said quietly, "I think we need to talk." The words hung in the air as everyone at the table turned to look at the night janitor who had just interrupted the most important conversation of their lives. Alexander's eyes widened as he realized that Thomas knew far more about his family than he had ever suspected. Victoria looked confused by the interruption and the sudden tension that seemed to fill the room. The triplets looked back and forth between their father and Thomas, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Thomas stepped further into the room, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that somehow conveyed both respect and determination. "There are things happening in this house that go beyond what any of you understand," he continued, looking directly at Alexander. "And if you're planning to reveal family secrets tonight, there are consequences you need to consider first." Alexander felt the carefully constructed world he had built for his family beginning to crumble around him. The night that was supposed to answer questions was instead raising new ones that he wasn't sure he was prepared to address. He looked at Victoria, at his children, and at Thomas, realizing that the time for secrets and testing was over. One way or another, the truth was about to come out. The silence in the dining room stretched for what felt like eternity. Alexander's mind raced as he processed Thomas's unexpected interruption and the implications of his words. The carefully orchestrated evening had spiraled completely out of his control. His children sat frozen at the table. Victoria looked bewildered, and Thomas stood in the doorway with an expression that suggested he knew far more about the Blackwood family than anyone had realized. Alexander slowly rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and controlled despite the chaos swirling in his mind. "Children, Victoria, please excuse us for a moment. Thomas and I need to have a private conversation." His voice carried an authority that brooked no argument, though his tone remained gentle enough not to alarm Victoria. Marcus, Elena, and Adrian exchanged glances but remained seated. Adrian, ever the analytical one, spoke up first. "Dad, we're not children anymore. If this conversation involves our family, we have a right to know what's happening." Elena nodded in agreement, her artistic intuition telling her that this moment was significant beyond what she could understand. We've been feeling like something important has been hidden from us for months. Please don't send us away now. Marcus, usually the most straightforward of the three, simply crossed his arms and remained in his chair. His enhanced physical senses, which had been developing rapidly, were picking up tension and fear from everyone in the room except Thomas, who seemed strangely calm. Victoria, meanwhile, was trying to process what she was witnessing. She had come to dinner expecting a pleasant evening with the family she was growing to care about deeply. Instead, she found herself in the middle of what appeared to be a family crisis involving their night janitor. Her curatorial instincts, honed by years of researching and uncovering hidden histories, told her that something significant was happening. Alexander looked around the room, realizing that he had lost control of the situation entirely. The careful plans he had made to test Victoria and gradually reveal truths to his children had collapsed in a matter of minutes. He made a decision that went against every protective instinct he had developed over centuries of hiding his true nature. "Very well," he said, his voice heavy with resignation and determination. "Thomas, please join us. I believe it's time for complete honesty." Thomas stepped fully into the dining room, closing the door behind him. He moved with a confidence that seemed at odds with his usual deferential demeanor as the household staff. As he approached the table, Alexander noticed that Thomas carried himself differently when he wasn't performing the role of a simple janitor. "Mr. Blackwood," Thomas began, his voice respectful but firm, "before you say anything that can't be taken back, you should know that I've been aware of your true nature since my second week of employment here." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. In 8 centuries of existence, very few humans had ever detected his supernatural nature without being told. Those who did usually became threats that had to be dealt with permanently. The fact that Thomas had known for months and done nothing about it was both terrifying and intriguing. Victoria leaned forward, her confusion evident. "I'm sorry, but what exactly is everyone talking about? What true nature? What family secrets?" Adrian, whose intellectual curiosity had been building for months, seized on Thomas's words. "You knew something about our family? Is that why you took this job?" Thomas looked around the table, his gaze settling on each person before returning to Alexander. "I took this job because my grandmother taught me to recognize supernatural beings, and she also taught me that they deserve protection and respect as long as they don't harm innocent people. I've been watching your family for months, Mr. Blackwood, and I know that you've never hurt anyone, but I also know that you're taking dangerous risks." Elena's artistic intuition suddenly connected pieces that her rational mind had been struggling with. "Supernatural beings," she repeated slowly. "Dad, is Thomas saying that our family is different in ways that aren't natural?" Marcus, whose enhanced physical abilities had been causing him confusion and concern, felt a strange sense of relief at Thomas's words. "Is that why I've been able to do things that don't make sense? Why I can run faster and jump higher than should be possible?" Alexander closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on him. When he opened them again, his expression had changed. The mask of careful control he had worn for years was gone, replaced by something ancient and weary, but also oddly relieved. "Thomas is correct," Alexander said quietly. "Our family is not entirely human. I am what humans call a vampire, though that word carries many misconceptions. I am over 800 years old, and I have been hiding my true nature to protect all of you." Victoria's face went pale, and she gripped the edge of the table. Her rational mind immediately rejected what she had just heard, but another part of her recognized that it explained many things about Alexander that had puzzled her. His vast knowledge of historical periods he claimed to have only studied, his unusual sleep schedule, the way he never seemed to eat the meals Henri prepared, the strange artwork and artifacts in his study. "That's impossible," Victoria whispered. But even as she said it, she realized she didn't entirely believe her own denial. Elena stared at her father with wide eyes, her artistic mind immediately understanding that this revelation explained the supernatural quality of her paintings. "Are we vampires too? Is that why my paintings have been so strange lately?" Adrian leaned back in his chair, his analytical mind racing through implications. The family history research I've been doing, the gaps in the records, the multiple Alexander Blackwoods throughout history. That was all you, wasn't it? You've been using the same name for centuries. Marcus looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers as if seeing them for the first time. The speed, the strength, the way I can sense things that others can't. I'm becoming like you. Alexander nodded slowly, his heart breaking at the fear and confusion he could see in his children's eyes. You are my biological children, which means you carry supernatural blood. As you approach adulthood, certain abilities will manifest. I had hoped to delay this conversation until you were older and more prepared to understand the responsibilities that come with our nature. Thomas stepped forward, his expression sympathetic but urgent. Mr. Blackwood, with respect, they needed to know months ago. Their abilities are developing rapidly, and without proper guidance, they could accidentally expose themselves or hurt someone. Marcus nearly broke his opponent's wrist during last week's basketball game because he doesn't know how to control his strength. Alexander whirled to face Thomas, alarm clear in his features. You've been watching them at school? I've been protecting them, Thomas corrected firmly. My grandmother didn't just teach me to recognize supernatural beings. She taught me to help them when they need it. Your children have been struggling with changes they don't understand, and you've been so focused on testing Ms. Sterling that you haven't noticed how much help they need. Victoria, who had been silent as she processed the impossible conversation happening around her, finally found her voice. You've been testing me? What kind of testing? Alexander turned to face her, seeing the hurt and confusion in her green eyes. His heart sank as he realized that his attempts to protect everyone had instead put them all in danger. Victoria, I was trying to determine if you could accept the supernatural aspects of my family's life. I couldn't bear the thought of falling in love with someone who would ultimately reject what I am. So you used your children as test subjects? Victoria's voice rose slightly, though she kept it controlled. You put them in positions where their unusual abilities would be on display to see how I would react? Elena gasped, understanding flooding her features. The art exhibition you suggested I participate in. You wanted Victoria to see my paintings because you knew they were becoming supernatural. Marcus stared at his father with betrayal evident in his young features. The basketball games. You kept bringing Victoria to watch me play because you knew I was doing things that weren't normal. Adrian's analytical mind quickly pieced together the pattern and my research into our family history. You encouraged me to pursue it because you wanted to see if Victoria would notice the supernatural elements I was uncovering. Alexander felt the weight of his mistakes crashing down on him. In his desire to protect everyone, he had manipulated and endangered the people he loved most. I was trying to keep all of you safe. I thought if I could test Victoria's reactions gradually, I could determine whether revealing the truth would put our family at risk. Thomas shook his head, his expression disappointed but not surprised. Mr. Blackwood, in 800 years, haven't you learned that deception rarely protects anyone? Your children have been struggling with supernatural abilities for months without understanding what was happening to them. Ms. Sterling has been falling in love with someone who was lying to her about fundamental aspects of his identity, and meanwhile other people have started to notice unusual things about your family. The last statement sent a chill through Alexander. What other people? Thomas pulled out his phone and showed Alexander several photos. They were taken at various locations around town. Marcus at basketball practice, Elena at the art supply store, Adrian at the library. In each photo, there were other people in the background who seemed to be watching the Blackwood children with unusual interest. These people have been following your children for the past 3 weeks, Thomas explained. I've been documenting their surveillance because I recognized some of them from my grandmother's old journals. They're hunters, Mr. Blackwood. People who make it their business to find and eliminate supernatural beings. The blood drained from Alexander's face as he understood the implications. His attempts to test Victoria had not only put his family's secret at risk, but had also delayed the training his children needed to protect themselves. His deception had left them vulnerable at the worst possible time. Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Everyone turned to look at her as she struggled to process everything she had learned in the past few minutes. "I need some air," she said, her voice strained. I need some time to think." Alexander started to rise to follow her, but Thomas placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Let her go, Mr. Blackwood. She needs space to process this information. Pushing her right now will only make things worse." Victoria walked to the French doors that led to the garden, her steps unsteady. She paused at the threshold, turning back to look at the family she had been falling in love with. "I don't know how to process what I just heard, but I do know that I care about all of you too much to just walk away. I need time, but I'll be back." With that, she stepped out into the garden, leaving the Blackwood family alone with Thomas and the weight of revealed secrets. Elena was the first to break the silence that followed Victoria's departure. "Dad, are we in danger? Are these hunter people going to try to hurt us?" Alexander looked at the photos Thomas had shown him, his ancient mind shifting into survival mode. "We may be." "Thomas, how long have you known about this surveillance?" 3 weeks, Thomas replied. "I've been trying to figure out the best way to warn you without revealing how much I know about supernatural affairs. I was hoping you would notice my attempts to communicate with you, but you've been too distracted by your relationship with Miss Sterling." Adrian leaned forward, his intellectual curiosity overriding his fear. "Thomas, your grandmother taught you about supernatural beings? Was she a hunter too?" Thomas shook his head. "No, she was what some people call a guardian. Her family has a long tradition of helping supernatural beings who live peacefully among humans. We learn to recognize them so we can protect them from those who would do them harm." Marcus stood up, pacing to the window to look out at the garden where Victoria had disappeared. "What kind of training do we need? If we're developing supernatural abilities, how do we learn to control them?" Alexander felt a mixture of pride and sorrow as he looked at his children. Despite the shock and fear they must be feeling, they were asking practical questions and trying to understand their situation. They were stronger than he had given them credit for. "The training is complex," Alexander explained. "It involves learning to control your physical abilities, understanding your supernatural senses, and most importantly, learning how to live among humans without revealing what you are. It's a balance I've been maintaining for centuries, but it's not easy." Elena picked up her napkin and began nervously folding it as she spoke. "What about Victoria?" "She knows our secret now. What happens to her?" Thomas answered before Alexander could speak. "That depends on how she processes the information and what she decides to do with it. Some humans can accept supernatural beings and even help protect them. Others can't handle the knowledge and either try to expose them or distance themselves completely." Alexander walked to the window where Marcus stood, looking out at the garden. He could see Victoria's silhouette in the moonlight as she sat on a bench near the fountain, her head in her hands. "I've made so many mistakes," he admitted. "I was so afraid of losing someone I love again that I risked everyone's safety." Adrian joined his father and brother at the window. "Dad, we understand why you were afraid. Losing Mom was horrible for all of us, but we're not children anymore, and we deserve to know the truth about ourselves and our family." Elena approached the group at the window, her artistic intuition picking up on the emotional undercurrents in the room. "What do we do now? How do we handle the hunters who are watching us? How do we help Victoria process all of this? How do we learn to control our abilities?" Alexander turned away from the window to face Thomas, recognizing that the janitor who wasn't really a janitor might be their best hope for navigating this crisis. "Thomas, your grandmother's tradition of helping supernatural beings, does that extend to providing sanctuary or protection when they're being hunted?" Thomas nodded gravely. "It does. But there are protocols that need to be followed, and decisions that need to be made quickly. The hunters who are watching your family aren't just random individuals. Based on what I've observed, they're part of an organized group that has significant resources and experience." Marcus turned from the window, his enhanced hearing picking up sounds from the garden. "Victoria's crying," he said quietly. "Should someone go check on her?" Alexander's heart clenched at the information. The woman he had fallen in love with was sitting alone in his garden, trying to process the revelation that the man she cared about was a centuries-old vampire and that the children she had grown fond of were developing supernatural abilities. His testing had not only failed to prepare her gradually for the truth, but had probably made the shock of revelation even worse. "I should go to her," Alexander said, but Thomas again shook his head. "Mr. Blackwood, with respect, you're the last person she needs to see right now. She needs time to process the fact that you've been lying to her since the day you met. Sending anyone from your family out there right now could make her feel pressured or trapped." Elena looked between Thomas and her father, her artistic empathy helping her understand Victoria's emotional state. "But we can't just leave her alone out there, especially if there are hunters watching our property." Thomas checked his phone, looking at what appeared to be some kind of security application. "The perimeter is secure for now, and I have sensors that will alert me if anyone approaches the property. Miss Sterling is safe in the garden, and she needs this time to think." Adrian, ever practical, focused on the immediate problems they needed to solve. "Thomas, these hunters who are watching us, what do they typically do when they identify a supernatural family? Do they try to expose them publicly, or do they take more direct action?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Alexander had dealt with hunters before, but not while trying to protect 3 children who were just developing their abilities. The stakes had never been higher, and his mistakes had left them all vulnerable. Thomas's expression grew even more serious. "It depends on the organization and their methods. Some try to gather evidence for public exposure. Others prefer permanent solutions that don't risk public knowledge of supernatural beings. Based on the equipment and techniques I've observed with this group, I believe they're planning more than just surveillance." The implications of Thomas's words sank in as the family realized they were facing immediate physical danger. The revelation of supernatural secrets, the crisis with Victoria, and the threat from hunters had all converged into a perfect storm that would require all of their strength and cooperation to survive. Alexander looked around at his children, at Thomas, and out at Victoria in the garden, understanding that the decisions they made in the next few hours would determine whether his family survived this crisis intact or whether everything he had spent centuries building would be destroyed. But before anyone could speak, the lights in the mansion suddenly went out, plunging them into darkness. Thomas's phone immediately began buzzing with security alerts, and Marcus's enhanced senses picked up the sound of vehicles approaching the property from multiple directions. "They're here," Thomas said grimly, his calm demeanor finally showing cracks of concern. "The hunters have decided to make their move tonight." The darkness that engulfed the mansion was absolute, as if someone had cut the power to the entire estate. Alexander's supernatural vision immediately adjusted, allowing him to see clearly while his children and Thomas struggled in the sudden blackout. Through the windows, he could see tactical lights moving systematically across his property as multiple vehicles surrounded the mansion. "Everyone stay calm," Alexander commanded, his voice carrying the authority of centuries. His paternal instincts warred with his survival training as he realized his worst fears were coming true. The hunters had chosen tonight, when his family was already in emotional turmoil and Victoria was vulnerable in the garden, to make their attack. Marcus's enhanced senses were overwhelmed by the sudden influx of information. He could hear heartbeats from at least a dozen people positioned around the property, smell the metallic scent of weapons, and feel vibrations through the floor that suggested heavy equipment being moved into position. "Dad, there are too many of them. I can hear them everywhere." Elena pressed herself against the wall, her artistic intuition screaming danger signals that her rational mind couldn't fully process. "What do they want? Are they going to try to kill us?" Adrian's analytical mind was racing through possible scenarios and escape routes, but the darkness and stress were making it difficult to think clearly. "Thomas, do you have a way to contact your Guardian network? Can they send help?" Thomas was rapidly typing on his phone, using what appeared to be a specialized app that didn't require internet connectivity. "I'm sending an emergency signal now, but help won't arrive for at least 30 minutes. We need to survive until then." Alexander moved swiftly to a painting on the wall, pressing a hidden mechanism that revealed a concealed weapons cache. Inside were items that looked like antiques but were clearly functional: silver-lined blades, wooden stakes, and other tools designed for supernatural warfare. He also pulled out what appeared to be a modern tactical vest and communication equipment. "Thomas, how long have you been preparing for this?" Alexander asked as he rapidly equipped himself with weapons and protective gear. "Since the day I started working here," Thomas replied, pulling his own concealed equipment from what had appeared to be a simple janitor's cart. "My grandmother taught me to always be prepared for the worst-case scenario." The sound of glass breaking came from the front of the house, followed by the systematic footsteps of people entering the mansion. Alexander realized they had perhaps minutes before the hunters reached the dining room. He needed to get his children to safety, find Victoria in the garden, and somehow survive against overwhelming odds. "There's a safe room in the basement," Alexander told his children. "Thomas, can you get them there safely?" "Dad, no," Marcus said firmly, his young voice carrying surprising strength. "We're not leaving you to face this alone. You said we have supernatural abilities. Maybe it's time we learn to use them." Elena nodded in agreement, her fear transforming into determination. "We're a family," said Bessie. "We stay together." Adrian was already moving toward the weapons cache, his intellectual curiosity about their supernatural heritage suddenly becoming practical knowledge. "Dad, teach us what we need to know. We can learn as we fight." Alexander felt a surge of pride mixed with terror as he looked at his children. They were no longer the young teenagers he had been trying to protect. They were young adults ready to fight for their family. But they were also untrained and vulnerable, facing enemies who had years of experience hunting supernatural beings. Very well, Alexander decided, knowing they had no other choice. "But we do this strategically. Marcus, your enhanced speed and strength are your advantages, but you must control them precisely. Elena, your artistic intuition can help you anticipate opponents' movements. Adrian, your analytical mind can help you identify patterns and weaknesses in their tactics." Thomas distributed communication devices to each family member. "These will keep us in contact even if we get separated. The hunters are using jamming equipment, but these operate on frequencies they won't expect." The sounds of the hunters moving through the house were getting closer. Alexander could distinguish at least 3 separate teams, each moving with military precision through different sections of the mansion. They were being methodical and thorough, checking each room before advancing. "What about Victoria?" Elena asked, voicing the concern they all shared. "She's still in the garden, and she doesn't know what's happening." Alexander looked out the window using his supernatural vision to scan the garden. He could see Victoria still sitting on the bench near the fountain, but he could also see 2 figures in dark clothing moving through the landscaping toward her position. "I have to get to her," Alexander said, moving toward the garden doors. "Mr. Blackwood! Wait!" Thomas called out, checking his security monitors. "The garden is surrounded. If you go out there, you'll be walking into a trap." Marcus stepped forward, his enhanced senses focused on the sounds coming from outside. "I can get to her faster than any of you. My speed advantage might let me reach her before they do." "Absolutely not," Alexander said firmly. "You don't have enough training to—" His words were cut off by the sound of the dining room door being kicked open. 3 figures in tactical gear entered the room, their weapons trained on the family. They moved with practiced efficiency, clearly expecting to find vampires who would be helpless in the darkness they had created. What they didn't expect was a family that was prepared to fight back. Marcus moved with supernatural speed, crossing the room in less than a second and disarming the first hunter before the man could react. Elena, trusting her artistic intuition, threw herself to the side just as the second hunter fired a weapon loaded with wooden projectiles. Adrian grabbed one of the antique weapons from Alexander's cache and used his analytical skills to identify the weakest point in the third hunter's armor. Alexander himself moved with 8 centuries of combat experience, flowing like water between his children to support their attacks and protect them from counterstrikes. The 3 hunters, despite their preparation and experience, found themselves overwhelmed by a family fighting with both supernatural abilities and desperate determination. Thomas coordinated their movements using the communication devices, calling out warnings and tactical information that helped them work together effectively. Within minutes, all 3 hunters were unconscious on the dining room floor. "That was the advance team," Thomas reported, checking his security monitors. "There are still at least 9 more hunters on the property, and they know their advance team has been compromised." Alexander rapidly searched the unconscious hunters, finding communication equipment and tactical plans that revealed the full scope of the attack. "They're not just here to capture or kill us," he realized with growing horror. "They're planning to burn down the mansion with us inside, making it look like an accident. They want to eliminate all evidence of supernatural beings." Elena gasped. "That means Victoria is in even more danger." "If they're planning to burn everything," Marcus was already moving toward the garden doors. "I'm getting her, and none of you can stop me." "Marcus, wait!" Alexander called out, but his son was already outside, moving with supernatural speed across the darkened garden toward Victoria's position. Alexander, Elena, Adrian, and Thomas watched through the windows as Marcus reached Victoria just as the 2 hunters were about to grab her. Victoria's scream of shock and fear echoed across the garden as Marcus engaged the hunters, his untrained but powerful abilities allowing him to hold his own against experienced opponents. "We have to help him," Elena said, moving toward the door. Thomas checked his equipment one more time. "The main force of hunters is about to breach the house. If we go outside now, we'll be caught between 2 groups of enemies." Alexander made a command decision that went against every protective instinct he had developed as a father. "Elena, Adrian, you're coming with me to help Marcus. Thomas, can you hold the house?" "I can buy you some time," Thomas replied, pulling out what appeared to be a sophisticated defensive system. "But not long. You need to move fast." The 4 of them burst through the garden doors just as Marcus was being overwhelmed by the 2 hunters. Victoria was pressed against the fountain, her hands over her mouth in shock as she watched the teenage boy she had grown fond of fighting for his life with abilities that defied human explanation. Alexander reached the fight first, his centuries of combat experience allowing him to quickly disable one of the hunters. Elena used her artistic intuition to anticipate the second hunter's movements, helping Adrian land a precise strike that rendered the man unconscious. Marcus was breathing heavily, his newly developed abilities having pushed him to his limits. "I got her!" he panted, looking at Victoria with a mixture of relief and concern. "But Dad, she saw everything. She knows what I can do now." Victoria looked around at the Blackwood family, her green eyes wide with a mixture of fear, confusion, and something else that Alexander couldn't quite identify. "You're really vampires," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of conflict coming from the mansion behind them. "Victoria," Alexander began, but she held up her hand to stop him. "Not now," she said firmly. "Right now, people are trying to hurt you and your children. We can talk about supernatural revelations later, but first we need to survive this." Her practical response surprised everyone, but there was no time to process it because Thomas's voice came through their communication devices with urgency. "They've breached the house." "I'm falling back to the basement. You need to find another way off the property." Alexander scanned the estate, his supernatural senses picking up the locations of the remaining hunters. They were systematically closing in on the garden, cutting off escape routes and preparing to corner the family in the open space. "The garage," Adrian said suddenly, his analytical mind finding a solution. "Dad, your classic car collection includes that 1967 Mustang you've been restoring. It has a modified engine, doesn't it?" Alexander realized what his son was thinking. "Yes, but it's not built for carrying 6 people. We don't have a choice," Elena pointed out. "It's either try to escape in an overpacked classic car or stay here and fight a dozen hunters in the open." Victoria, who had been quietly processing everything happening around her, suddenly spoke up. "I know these grounds better than the hunters do. I've been walking through this garden for weeks. There's a service road that leads to the back gate. It's how the landscaping crews bring in equipment. If we can reach it without being seen, we might be able to escape." Thomas's voice crackled through the communication devices again. "They're using thermal imaging to track you. Whatever you're going to do, do it now." Alexander made the decision for all of them. We run for the garage. Stay together, move fast, and if anyone gets separated, rendezvous at the old oak tree at the north edge of the property. The family began moving as a unit across the garden, with Victoria guiding them along paths that provided the most cover from the tactical lights sweeping the estate. Marcus used his enhanced speed to scout ahead, Elena trusted her intuition to guide them away from danger, and Adrian used his analytical skills to identify the safest route through the landscaping. They had almost reached the garage when a spotlight suddenly illuminated them, followed immediately by shouts from multiple directions. The hunters had found them, and they were surrounded. "Run!" Alexander shouted, pushing his children and Victoria toward the garage while turning to face the approaching hunters. His vampire nature fully emerged as he prepared to fight with everything he had to protect his family. But instead of running, Marcus, Ayla, and Adrian stood their ground beside their father. Victoria, after a moment of hesitation, picked up one of the weapons dropped by the unconscious hunters and took a defensive position with the family. "I told you," Marcus said, his enhanced abilities fully manifested as adrenaline and determination flooded his system. "We're a family. We stay together." Elena's artistic intuition was now operating at a supernatural level, allowing her to predict the hunters' movements with uncanny accuracy. "Dad, there are 6 of them approaching from the east, 3 from the west, and 2 circling around to cut off our escape route." Adrian's analytical mind was processing tactical information faster than should have been humanly possible. "They're using a pincer movement to trap us against the garage. But if we can break through the eastern group, we have a clear path to the service road Victoria mentioned." Alexander looked at his children, his brave, determined, supernatural children, and at Victoria, the human woman who had chosen to stand with them despite learning impossible truths about their nature. In that moment, he realized that his centuries of hiding and protecting had been based on underestimating the people he loved. "Very well," he said, his voice carrying both ancient authority and paternal pride. "We fight together." The battle that followed was unlike anything the Blackwood estate had ever witnessed. Alexander fought with 8 centuries of experience flowing between opponents like a force of nature. Marcus moved with supernatural speed and strength, but now guided by the training his father provided through their communication devices. Elena's enhanced intuition allowed her to anticipate and counter attacks that should have been impossible to predict. Adrian used his supernatural analytical abilities to identify weaknesses and coordinate the family's movements with tactical precision. Victoria, despite being fully human, fought with a determination and courage that impressed even Alexander. She moved with intelligence and purpose, using the weapon she had acquired and the knowledge she had gained from watching the family's supernatural abilities. Thomas emerged from the mansion behind them, having escaped the basement through tunnels Alexander hadn't even known existed. He brought additional weapons and equipment, as well as news that help from the Guardian network was finally approaching. The tide of the battle turned when the hunters realized they were facing not just supernatural beings, but a coordinated family unit that combined centuries of experience with emerging supernatural abilities and human determination. Their tactical advantages were neutralized by opponents who fought with both supernatural skills and desperate love for each other. When the last hunter was either unconscious or retreating into the darkness beyond the estate, the Blackwood family found themselves standing together in their garden, breathing heavily and looking at each other with a mixture of exhaustion and amazement. "Is it over?" Elena asked, her artistic intuition still picking up traces of tension and danger. Thomas checked his communication devices and security monitors. "The immediate threat is over. The Guardian network has people surrounding the property now, and they're tracking down any hunters who escaped. But this isn't the end. It's the beginning of a new phase in your lives." Victoria looked around at the family she had been falling in love with, seeing them clearly for the first time. Alexander, ancient and powerful, but also vulnerable in his love for his children. Marcus, Elena, and Adrian, no longer children but young supernatural beings learning to control incredible abilities. Thomas, the Guardian, who had been protecting them all without any of them knowing. "Alexander," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of decision, "we need to talk." Alexander nodded, understanding that this conversation would determine whether Victoria remained in their lives or walked away from everything she had discovered. Yes, we do. But first, Victoria continued, surprising him again, we need to make sure your children are safe and that Thomas has the support he needs from this guardian network he mentioned. The personal conversation can wait until everyone is secure. Thomas smiled at Victoria's priorities. Miss Sterling, if you decide to stay involved with this family, you're going to fit in very well with the guardian tradition. Elena stepped forward, her artistic empathy helping her understand Victoria's emotional state. Victoria, I know this is all impossible to process. You don't have to make any decisions right now. John Marcus nodded in agreement. We understand if you need time or if you decide this is too much to handle. Adrian, with his analytical mind, added, but we also want you to know that we hope you'll stay. You've become important to all of us. Alexander looked at Victoria, seeing the woman who had stood beside his family in battle, who had chosen to help protect his children despite learning that everything she thought she knew about them was based on carefully constructed deceptions. Victoria, he said softly, I owe you an apology for the testing, for the deception, for putting you in danger because of my own fears and mistakes. Whether you decide to stay or go, I want you to know that my feelings for you are real and my respect for your courage tonight is absolute. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, looking around at the family and at Thomas, processing everything she had experienced and learned. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and decisive. Alexander, your testing and deception hurt me deeply, and we're going to have to work through that if we're going to have any kind of relationship. But tonight, I watched you and your children fight to protect each other and to protect me. I saw a family that loves each other enough to risk everything, and I saw supernatural beings who use their abilities to defend rather than to harm. She paused, looking directly into Alexander's eyes. I also realized that I've been falling in love with someone whose true nature I couldn't see because you were hiding it from me. I'd like the chance to fall in love with who you really are if you're willing to be honest with me from now on. Alexander felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Are you saying you can accept what we are? Victoria smiled for the first time since the evening's revelations began. I'm saying I want to learn what you are. And I want to be part of helping Marcus, Elena, and Adrian understand and control their abilities as they grow into whatever they're becoming. Thomas cleared his throat diplomatically. If I may suggest, this would be an excellent time for all of you to meet with the Guardian Network's Council. They can provide resources for training supernatural abilities, protection from hunter organizations, and guidance for humans who become involved with supernatural families. Marcus looked at his father. Dad, does this mean we don't have to hide anymore? At least not from each other? Elena added, can we finally learn about our family history and our supernatural heritage? Adrian, ever practical, asked, and can we get proper training so we don't accidentally hurt someone or expose ourselves? Alexander looked around at his children, at Victoria, and at Thomas, realizing that the night that had begun as his final test had instead become the beginning of a new chapter in all their lives. A chapter based on honesty instead of deception, cooperation instead of individual protection, and acceptance instead of fear. Yes, he said simply, to all of it. It's time for the Blackwood family to stop hiding from ourselves and start learning to live authentically in the world. Victoria reached out and took Alexander's hand, her touch warm and reassuring. Then let's start learning together. Thomas smiled, recognizing the moment when a crisis transformed into an opportunity for growth and healing. Welcome to the Guardian Network, everyone. You're going to find that the world is much more complicated and much more wonderful than you ever imagined. As dawn began to break over the Blackwood estate, the family stood together in their garden, surrounded by the evidence of the night's battle, but looking toward a future filled with possibility. The mansion would need repairs, the hunter threat would require ongoing vigilance, and there would be much work to do in learning to control supernatural abilities and navigate relationships based on complete honesty. But for the first time in years, Alexander felt hope. His children knew the truth about their heritage and were ready to embrace it. Victoria had chosen to stay and learn about their supernatural world. Thomas had revealed himself as an ally rather than a threat, and the Guardian Network offered support and community that Alexander hadn't experienced in centuries. The Vampire King had spent 800 years learning to hide in the shadows, but his children were going to learn to live authentically in the light, and he was going to learn alongside them, finally free from the burden of secrets that had shaped his existence for so long. As they walked back toward the mansion to begin the work of rebuilding and healing, Elena looked back at the garden where so much had been revealed and decided, "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I think this would make an incredible painting." The moment when secrets became truth and fear became courage. Marcus laughed, the sound carrying relief and joy. "Just promise me you won't paint it with those supernatural effects that make people nervous." Adrian grinned. "Actually, I think those effects are exactly what people need to see. Art that shows them the magic that exists in the world, even when they don't realize it." Victoria squeezed Alexander's hand. "I think I'd like to see that painting when it's finished. All of it, the supernatural effects included." Alexander smiled, understanding that his family had found not just survival but acceptance, not just safety but joy. The testing was over, the secrets were revealed, and the real work of living authentically could finally begin. As they entered the mansion together, the first rays of sunrise streaming through the repaired windows, the Blackwood family stepped into a future built on truth, trust, and the kind of love that could survive any revelation and overcome any threat. The Vampire King, left a widower, secretly tested his lover using his triplets. But the janitor exposed the secret.